Close your eyes for a moment. Not literally, don't do that while you're driving, but imagine it. Imagine a silence so complete, so dense, that it presses against your eardrums like something alive. Not the absence of sound, the presence of quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in places where something has already happened and the world hasn't decided yet how to process it. That's where this story begins. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to answer in the comments. Where are you right now, listening to this? Because this particular story, I think the location you're in while you hear it matters more than you might expect. A lot of people have told me they couldn't finish certain stories alone at night. Some people say they actually had to pause and walk away for a minute. If that happens to you tonight, I'll take it as a compliment. What I'm about to tell you is set in the Appalachian Highlands in the autumn of 1897. It involves a man who was sent to measure the mountains and instead discovered that something in those mountains had been measuring us back for a very, very long time. The settlement I'm going to describe has no name on any map printed after 1924. The county records that might have confirmed its existence were largely destroyed in a courthouse fire. What survives are fragments, correspondence, a partial census entry, and a set of field notebooks donated to a Virginia historical archive in the 1970s by an estate executor who had no idea what she was handing over. Those notebooks are the spine of this story. Everything I tell you tonight is drawn from them. The place was called Greystone Notch, tucked into a fold of mountain terrain where three ridgelines converged around a narrow valley floor. It was the kind of settlement that had been disappearing for 20 years before anyone thought to notice. A creek called Harrow Branch ran cold and fast through the center of it, fed by underground springs that the locals swore never froze, even in the harshest winters. The stone bridge that crossed it, locally known as the Notch Bridge, was the oldest structure in the valley, and no one alive could say with certainty who had built it or when. Into this place, on a Thursday in early September 1897, came a man named Edmund Calloway. He was 36 years old, a land surveyor contracted by the Appalachian Central Railway to assess potential route corridors through the Eastern Highlands. Tall, lean, weathered, the kind of man who'd spent more time under open sky than beneath a roof, and carried that fact in his posture and the particular stillness of his eyes, which were a pale, shifting gray that people sometimes found unsettling without being able to say exactly why. Edmund had been doing this work for 11 years. He had walked routes that broke other surveyors. He had mapped terrain that resisted being mapped, in hollows where compasses behaved strangely and landmarks seemed to move between visits. He had a reputation among the railway companies for being impossible to rattle. One engineer who'd worked with him described Edmund as a man who treats the unexplained as simply a measurement he hasn't taken yet. He was about to meet something that couldn't be measured, at least not with any instruments he'd brought with him. Edmund arrived at Greystone Notch as the sun was already dropping behind the western ridge, which, in these deep hollows, happened aggressively early, the mountains stealing hours from both ends of the day. The settlement was perhaps 20 structures in total. Log-built homes with stone chimneys, a general store doubling as a post office, a forge he could hear before he could see it, and what appeared to be a church or meeting house whose door hung slightly open into darkness, as if the building itself had stopped exhaling. The census had listed Greystone Notch at 58 residents. Edmund suspected that number was generous by at least a third. The settlement had the particular emptiness that comes to places people are leaving slowly, one family at a time, one season at a time, until only the stubborn and the trapped remain. He'd arranged lodgings through correspondence with a woman named Della Pruitt, who ran the only boarding establishment in the Notch, a two-story structure that leaned imperceptibly eastward, as though the hillside behind it were pressing it forward in slow motion. Della was waiting on the porch when he arrived, 60 or so, gray-haired, with the compact, unhurried manner of someone who had never once been surprised by the world and wasn't planning to start. She assessed him the way mountain people assess outsiders, completely, efficiently, and without apology. "You'll want the back room," she said before he could introduce himself. "Better light for working, and you won't hear the forge." He thanked her and carried his equipment inside. The transit, the chains, the plotting tools, the field books, and the worn canvas pack that held everything else he owned that mattered. The room was spare but clean. A plank wood floor worn smooth in the footpaths, a cornhusk mattress on an iron frame, a desk positioned beneath a window that faced east. He set his equipment in the corner, crossed to the window, and looked out over the valley as the last light went out of the sky. Not fading, but dying, he thought, which was an odd way to think about a sunset. He pulled the curtain closed earlier than he needed to. He couldn't have said why. That night, lying awake in the unfamiliar dark, Edmund listened to the boarding house settle around him, the creak of old timber, the distant pull of harrow branch over its rocky bed, and beneath those sounds, something else. A low, barely there murmur that seemed to come from underneath everything, from the stone beneath the floorboards, from the mountain itself. He told himself it was the creek. He was almost certain it was the creek. Morning arrived late to the hollow. The sun had to clear the eastern ridge before it could touch the valley floor, which meant the settlement remained wrapped in dense fog for the first 2 hours of daylight. Edmund came downstairs to find a breakfast of fried cornmeal, cured pork, and coffee so strong it looked like river water after a flood. He and Della ate in a silence that was not quite comfortable. He explained his plans: begin on the eastern ridge, establish benchmark positions, and work his way north to a terrain feature his maps labeled as Bracken's Crown, a broad promontory he needed to assess for grade viability. Something shifted in Della's expression at the mention of Bracken's Crown. Not alarm exactly, something more controlled than alarm, a tightening around the eyes. "That's hard country up there," she said carefully, setting down her cup. "Hard in ways that don't show on maps. The ridge gets narrow coming up from the north face, and the drop-offs aren't always where you'd expect them. Some of the terrain up there tends to confuse people. Men who know what they're doing have come back disoriented." Edmund appreciated the warming and told her he preferred to work alone, that he moved faster without adjusting to anyone else's pace. Della accepted this without pressing, but when he went to gather his equipment, he noticed her watching from the doorway with an expression that was careful and held something he couldn't name. It might have been worry. It might have been something closer to grief. The fog hadn't fully lifted when Edmund set out, but it was beginning to thin in patches, tearing open to reveal brief windows of the slope above. He followed a trail up through dense stands of oak and hickory, the leaves already turning, splashes of amber and deep rust appearing suddenly in the gray and then dissolving again as he moved past. The climb was steep enough that he had to stop several times to rest, using those pauses to take compass bearings and make preliminary notes. The fog moved strangely on this ridge, not the way fog normally behaves, burning off in predictable patterns as the morning warmed. This fog moved with a kind of awareness, opening ahead of him, closing behind, creating the persistent impression that the visible world was only a few yards deep in any direction. And more than once, Edmund had the disconcerting sensation that the trees around him were subtly different each time a pocket of visibility opened, that the landscape was rearranging itself just outside his line of sight. He told himself this was a natural effect of limited visibility and physical exertion. He was almost sure he was right. He reached the ridgeline after nearly 2 hours of climbing. The fog was thinner up here, ragged and intermittent, giving him brief glimpses of the valley below and the mountains beyond, layer upon layer of blue ridges retreating into distance like something that had always been there and always would be. He spent the morning establishing his first benchmark position, working with the focused precision that had always been his greatest professional asset, the ability to narrow the world down to what the transit showed him and the numbers in his notebook. It wasn't until late morning, with the sun high and the fog nearly gone, that he realized he'd been hearing something for a while without consciously registering it. A rhythmic tapping, metal on stone, coming from the north. Not close, maybe 200 yards, but clear and distinct in the still mountain air. His first thought was another surveyor. His second was a small mining operation, though he'd seen nothing in his preliminary research to suggest there was active extraction work in this area. He packed up his transit and moved toward the sound, navigating across the uneven ridge surface, picking his path carefully. The tapping grew clearer as he approached, more regular but with a rhythm he couldn't quite decode, not the simple pattern of someone driving a stake or testing rock hardness, but something more complex, following some internal logic that Edmund couldn't quite grasp. He rounded a shoulder of exposed granite and stopped. The source of the tapping was immediately visible, but what he was seeing made no sense. Perhaps 50 yards ahead, an elderly man was working on the exposed rock face of the ridge with a hammer and chisel. That much was comprehensible. What wasn't comprehensible was the pattern of his work, striking in one spot, then moving several feet to another location, then another, following some invisible map across the stone surface. Not testing, not clearing, carving, deliberately, methodically carving. Edmund stood and watched for nearly a minute before calling out. His voice carried easily in the mountain air. The old man didn't respond, didn't pause, didn't give any indication that he'd heard. Edmund called out again, louder, still nothing. He approached carefully, picking his way across the rocky surface, and as the distance closed, he could see the man more clearly. He was old, 70 perhaps or more, with hair that had gone white and hung past his collar, tangled and unkempt. His clothes were of good quality, a wool coat that might have been professional dress at some point in its history, now so worn and faded that the original color was beyond recovery. His hands, gripping hammer and chisel with apparent ease despite their gnarled, swollen knuckles, were those of a man who had been doing physical labor for decades. And his face, when Edmund finally got close enough to see it clearly, was so deeply lined that it looked less like skin and more like bark, weathered and carved by time in the same way stone is carved by weather, until what remains is not the original surface, but something shaped by long exposure to forces that don't negotiate. Edmund could now see what the old man was carving into the stone. He stopped. His surveyor's mind, trained to find pattern and structure in everything it encountered, struggled completely. The stone was covered with marks, hundreds of them certainly, possibly thousands if the carvings continued around the curve of the rock face. They were at varying depths, some fresh and bright where the chisel had recently bitten, others weathered dark as if they'd been there years. They weren't letters or numbers or any notation system Edmund recognized. They weren't representations of natural forms. They were abstract and geometric, circles, angles, intersecting lines that formed patterns that seemed to have an underlying logic he could almost follow, almost see, but kept sliding away from comprehension the moment he thought he'd grasped it. Looking directly at certain sections made his eyes ache in a way that was more than just the strain of focus. He reached out and touched the old man's shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The old man spun around with a speed that seemed impossible for someone of his apparent age and physical condition, the hammer rising in a motion that was clearly defensive, the chisel pulled back. Edmund stumbled away, catching himself on the rock face, and for a moment the two men faced each other across 3 feet of exposed ridgetop. The old man's eyes were extraordinary, deeply sunken beneath heavy brows, almost lost in shadow, but burning with an intensity that was immediately unsettling. Not the brightness of madness, but something that looked more like the brightness of terrible knowledge, of a mind that had seen more than it could comfortably contain and had organized itself around that weight. When he spoke, his voice was rough and painful sounding, like a machine that hadn't been used in a long time, trying to remember what it was for. "You shouldn't be here,"
he said. Each word arrived separately, with a pause between, as though each required individual assembly. No one should be here, not yet, not while it is still incomplete. He paused, and something changed in his expression, not a softening, but a reorganization, as though he were actively deciding how much to say. How long has it been since you left the settlement? And here, I need to pause for a moment, because I find this detail genuinely fascinating, and I want to know if you've experienced something similar. Have you ever walked into a situation that was clearly wrong, not dangerous wrong, not threatening wrong, but wrong in a way you couldn't articulate? A place or a moment that felt like it existed slightly sideways from ordinary reality? Drop that in the comments. I'm going to come back and read these, because the answers to that question, historically, tend to be more interesting than the question itself. Also, if you're listening on a channel that isn't the fear behind you, you might be watching a stolen upload. We don't monetize that, and the people who do aren't the ones who spent weeks researching and writing this story. Report it if you see it, and come find the original. All right, back to Edmund Calloway on a mountain ridge in 1897, facing a man who had just asked him a question that should have not been alarming, but somehow was. Edmund answered honestly. He'd left the settlement at dawn, perhaps 4 hours ago. The old man's expression shifted, some calculation happening behind those sunken eyes. Then he lowered the hammer, though he didn't set it down. "I was a surveyor," the old man said, his voice still rough but the hostility draining out of it, replaced with something more complex. "A man who measures things. I had a student who wanted to be a surveyor once. That was a long time ago." He looked at Edmund for a long moment. "My name was Elias Vane," he said. The word was careful in his usage. "I say was because I'm not certain the designation still applies accurately. I was a professor of mathematics and natural philosophy at a university in the valley. I came to these mountains in 1879 to investigate geological anomalies reported by hunters, formations in the rock that didn't conform to any understood pattern of stratification. I expected to spend 3 weeks here." He looked at the carved stone around him. That was 18 years ago.
Edmund's trained instinct was to assess the situation practically. This was a man who had clearly suffered severe mental deterioration from long isolation, who had constructed an elaborate delusional framework around his obsessive carving work, and who needed to be brought down from this ridge and connected with some form of care. The right response was calm, patient engagement, the kind you'd use to stabilize someone in distress, followed by a gentle extraction. He was almost certain that was the right response. Elias Vane seemed to read the assessment in his face. Mountain people, and this man had been a mountain person for 18 years, whatever he'd been before, develop a particular sensitivity to condescension. "You think I've lost my mind," Elias said flatly. "That's the reasonable conclusion. I would have reached it too 18 years ago if someone had described my current circumstances to me. I'd like to show you something before you make that determination final. I'd like to show you what I've been spending 18 years trying to contain." Edmund's instinct said to refuse, politely, firmly, and begin the process of walking this man back toward the settlement. Instead, he found himself saying, "Show me." He was never entirely sure, afterward, why he said it, perhaps because Elias's voice, when he made the offer, didn't have the pleading quality of someone seeking validation for a delusion. It had the quality of someone making a decision they knew was not fully reversible. They walked north along the ridge for 20 minutes. Elias moved with a confidence that spoke of 10,000 repetitions of this path, sure-footed over terrain that Edmund had to pick across carefully. The ridgeline narrowed in places to 8 or 9 feet wide, with steep drop-offs on either side, the trees thinning out until the ridgeline was nothing but exposed rock under open sky. The promontory that opened up ahead of them, perhaps 30 yards across at its widest, was what Edmund had marked on his maps as Bracken's Crown. Every square foot of it was carved.
the same symbols he'd seen Elias working on, but here in their full density and extent, covering the flat rock of the platform in an intricate, interlocking web of geometry that seemed, the longer Edmund looked at it, to be not many separate symbols, but one continuous design folding in on itself across the surface of the stone. He walked to the edge of the carved area and crouched down, running his fingers across the marks. Some were shallow, some were cut deep, an inch or more into the stone. The work was extraordinary in its precision and in the pure quantity of it. This was not the work of weeks or months. 18 years, Edmund said quietly. 17 on the upper platform. The first year I was still trying to understand what I was looking at, still trying to convince myself it was something ordinary. He moved to a position near the center of the platform and placed his open hand flat against a complex interlocking section of the design. What happened next is the point in Edmund's field notebooks where his handwriting changes. Before this moment, his entries are precise and controlled, the careful cursive of a trained professional. After this moment, the letters are larger and less regular, and certain words are written twice or circled, or written again in the margin. Not the writing of a man who has lost his composure exactly, the writing of a man trying to be precise about something that resists precision. The carved symbol beneath Elias's hand began to glow. A pale blue, cold and clear like the light that comes off deep ice. Not a reflection of sunlight, not bioluminescence from lichen. A glow that originated in the stone itself, at the carved lines and spread outward from Elias's hand in pulses that followed the geometry of the design across the entire surface of the platform. As the glow spread, the pattern became legible in a way it hadn't been before. The individual symbols weren't separate, they were components of a single construction, a geometric form that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the flat stone it was carved on should allow. Looking at certain intersections made Edmund's vision blur and correct itself, as though his eyes were trying to process depth information that shouldn't be there. And then, the air above the platform changed. It began as a shimmer, the kind of distortion you see above hot pavement in summer, but the temperature hadn't changed. What was shimmering was not air. What was shimmering was space itself, bending and refracting around an axis that Edmund couldn't locate or name. And through that distortion, he saw a sky that was wrong. Not a different shade of blue, not an unusual cloud formation, a sky that was a color Edmund had no name for, not because it was difficult to describe, but because it fell outside the range of colors that the human visual system is designed to perceive, and his brain was doing something desperate and imprecise as it tried to process what his eyes were sending it. Within that wrong sky, shapes moved. Too far away to resolve into detail, but present, undeniably, impossibly present. Elias let his hand drop, and the glow faded. The distortion contracted and was gone. The platform was just carved stone under autumn sky. I want to stop here, right at this moment, because I think this is the point in the story where your reaction tells you something important about yourself. Not whether you believe it or don't believe it, that's a separate question, but your gut response to this moment. Is it skepticism? Is it something that feels uncomfortably like recognition? Drop it in the comments. I'm serious. These conversations become something real, and I read them. Also, if you're not subscribed yet and you've made it this far, this is who we are. This is what we do. Historical cases, documented mysteries, the places where the archival record points towards something it can't fully explain. Subscribe and you won't miss whatever comes next. Now, Edmund sat down on the platform. His legs made a unilateral decision. Elias sat beside him, and for a while neither of them spoke. When the old man finally broke the silence, his voice was quieter. Exhausted, Edmund realized, in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. I don't know what they are. I have mathematical models that describe how our reality and theirs intersect at specific locations, this ridge being one, during certain astronomical cycles. I can tell you the geometry, I can tell you the timing, I cannot tell you what they are, or what they want, or whether want is even a concept that applies to them. What I can tell you is that they're aware of this location, that during a full convergence, which my calculations indicate will occur in spring of 1905, the dimensional intersection reaches its maximum depth, and the barrier between our reality and theirs becomes thin enough that they can attempt to cross. And what I can tell you is that the indigenous people of these mountains knew this. They had been maintaining barriers at the intersection points for generations, using a geometry they understood intuitively that I've spent 18 years trying to reconstruct mathematically. When those people were displaced, their knowledge went with them. The barriers began to degrade. I'm trying to rebuild what I can before the next convergence. Edmund asked the question his surveyor's training required him to ask, even though part of him wanted very much not to hear the answer. He asked what would happen if the barrier wasn't complete when the convergence came. Elias looked at him for a long moment. I've spent 18 years trying not to think about that with my full attention, because when I do, I find the implications paralyzing, and a paralyzed man can't carve stone.
Edmund spent the rest of that afternoon on the platform with Elias Vane, listening to explanations that moved fluidly between rigorous mathematics and observations that should have been incomprehensible, but somehow, in this context, weren't. The old man showed him how specific symbols in the carved pattern resonated with each other when traced in certain sequences, creating vibrations Edmund could feel through the stone beneath his palms more than he could hear with his ears. Frequencies that seemed to originate not from the surface of the rock, but from somewhere deeper, from the structure of the place itself. As the afternoon light thinned and the shadows began to pool in the valley below, Edmund faced a decision he hadn't anticipated having to make when he'd climbed this ridge that morning. He could treat what he'd seen as an elaborate illusion, something his tired mind had constructed from Elias's obvious conviction and the particular quality of mountain light. He could complete his survey, submit his report to the railway company, and move on to his next assignment. That was the sensible choice, the professional choice, the choice that preserved his existing understanding of how the world was organized. Or he could accept that his existing understanding of how the world was organized was incomplete in a way that had consequences, and that an old man working alone might not be able to meet those consequences in time. When Elias, quietly, without pressure, asked if Edmund might consider staying for a few days to help verify the geometric precision of the remaining sections using his surveying instruments, Edmund heard himself agreeing. He would think about this moment many times in the years that followed. He could never fully explain it, even to himself. He had seen what he had seen. He had felt what he had felt. His instruments told him what reality was made of, and what he'd witnessed on that platform was not in the data. But he had also, all his professional life, trusted his observations over his preconceptions, and his observations were unambiguous. That evening, back at Della Pruitt's boarding house, Edmund opened his field notebook and tried to record the day's events in the precise technical language that was his professional habit. He couldn't do it. The words that came were either too small for what he'd experienced or too large, either dry notation that stripped the events of their actual character or language that sounded exactly like the account of a man who had lost his mind. He finally wrote a single sentence: encountered significant terrain complication on Eastern Ridge, survey schedule delayed indefinitely. Then he closed the book. He tried, over dinner, to ask Della about Elias Vane, whether anyone in the settlement knew about the old man on the ridge, whether he had any connection to the community. Della's face went through a careful reorganization that told Edmund everything about what her answer was going to be before she said it. There are people, she said slowly, who go up to the high places and don't come back down. Not in the way you mean, not dead, just changed, like something up there claims them. We don't go looking. We provide what provisions we can manage to leave at the trailhead, and we don't ask questions that might have answers that would change how we live down here." She paused. "You'd be surprised how much you can maintain if you're careful about what you let yourself know." Edmund sat with that for a long time after she cleared the dishes. Over the following weeks, Edmund fell into a routine that split neatly along the axis of his identity. Mornings he spent on his official survey work, moving through it quickly with the efficiency that came with long practice, getting enough done to justify his continued presence without the work consuming the hours he needed elsewhere. Afternoons and early evenings he spent on the platform with Elias, learning what he was being asked to learn. The work Elias needed from him was precise and technical, using his transit to verify the geometric relationships between sections of the carved pattern, ensuring that angles held to fractions of a degree and that the spacing between elements maintained mathematical ratios that the old man claimed were critical to the pattern's function. He could do this. The instrument work was familiar even if the purpose was entirely foreign, and as he worked, Elias talked. He talked about what he'd found when he first came to the ridge, how the geological anomalies he'd come to study, formations in the rock that followed geometries inconsistent with normal stratification patterns, turned out to be not geological anomalies, but something else entirely. The deep substrate of an indigenous protective system, maintained over centuries by people who had known about the intersection points and organized their entire relationship with this landscape around managing them. He talked about his attempts in the early years to return to civilization and report what he'd discovered, how those attempts ended every time in the same place, in the face of someone's polite, patient, irrevocable disbelief. "There's a specific kind of isolation," Elias said, "that comes from knowing something true that no one will let you tell. It's worse than loneliness, because loneliness is about absence of company, and this is about absence of reality. The feeling that the truth you're carrying has no place to land, no surface to stick to in the world where other people are living." Edmund understood this in a way he hadn't expected to understand it, because he was already experiencing his own version of it, sitting across the dinner table with Della each evening, unable to explain why his survey work was taking so long, giving vague answers about complex terrain, when the real explanation was so far outside the boundaries of normal conversation that he couldn't even find the edge of how to begin. Della, he was beginning to notice, knew more than she was saying. The way she watched him leave each morning, the questions she didn't ask, the provisions she mentioned leaving at the trailhead, as if this were ordinary, as if this were simply something that was done. He would understand this later, much later. In mid-October, Elias said he needed to show Edmund something. He'd been holding back, he said. Didn't want to add to the weight Edmund was already carrying. But the work they were doing on the platform surface was only the outer layer of what needed to be maintained. And Edmund couldn't fully understand the stakes without seeing what lay beneath. They left the platform by a narrow path along the northern face of the ridge, descending carefully for about 10 minutes before reaching a section of rock face that was carved even more densely than anything Edmund had seen above. Symbols smaller and more tightly packed, covering the stone in overlapping layers that spoke of years of intensive, obsessive work. Elias traced a specific sequence of carvings, his fingers moving with practiced precision across the surface, and the same pale glow that Edmund had seen before began to rise from the lines. But this time, instead of spreading outward, it concentrated, gathered at a single point. And where it gathered, the rock ceased to be rock. It became translucent, then transparent, then simply absent, and opening approximately 3 feet in diameter, beyond which was darkness of a quality Edmund had never encountered. Not darkness as the absence of light, darkness as a presence, a darkness that absorbed and did not return. Elias handed him a lantern. Edmund held it to the opening and looked inside. The space beyond was wrong in a way that was immediately and viscerally apparent. It was too large, far too large for the amount of stone it was supposedly carved into, extending away from the opening into distances that the lantern light didn't reach, couldn't reach, seemed to diminish against rather than illuminate.
and the surfaces visible in that space, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, curving away into the dark, were carved with the same symbols as the exterior surfaces, thousands upon thousands of them, disappearing into the distance in patterns that his eyes followed for a few seconds before his visual system quietly declined to continue. "This is the intersection," Elias said quietly from beside him. "This is where our reality and theirs share the same coordinates. The carved passages go deeper, much deeper, following the geometry of the intersection inward. The indigenous protective system extends all the way to the contact boundary itself." Edmund asked if Elias had been inside. "Perhaps a quarter-mile," the old man said after a pause, "following the carved passages downward and inward. I stopped when I realized that the sounds I was hearing, the scratching and the movement on the other side of the barrier, were not getting quieter as I went deeper. They were getting clearer. And the quality of my own thinking was changing in ways I couldn't fully track in the moment, but could see, afterward, in the notes I'd written while I was down there. They were still logical, still sequential, but the underlying assumptions had shifted in ways that took me weeks to correct." He closed the opening then, reversing the sequence he'd traced, watching the rock solidify back into itself. And they stood in silence for a moment before beginning the climb back to the platform. As they climbed, Elias said, "There are sections in those passages I can no longer safely maintain, areas where the barrier is degrading, too far into the intersection for me to reach and repair without risking the kind of cognitive shift that I might not be able to reverse. That's what keeps me awake, not the convergence itself. What keeps me awake are the parts I can't reach." November came to the ridge with cold intent, frost on the platform warnings, tools that burned where skin met metal. Edmund had long since written to the railway company, explaining that the terrain was unsuitable for their proposed corridor. Geological instabilities, he'd said, which was the most accurate lie he'd ever written, and requesting that his contract be considered fulfilled. The bank draft arrived 2 weeks later, and with it came the strange, clarifying finality of someone who had just closed a door behind them without quite deciding to. He was no longer employed. He was simply here, doing this. The people of Greystone Notch gave him the same treatment they apparently gave Elias, the careful distance of a community that had learned not to ask certain questions. Provisions appeared at the trailhead. Della maintained his room without discussion of a departure date. When he passed people on the settlement's single road, they nodded without speaking, and their expressions held something complicated. Pity, possibly, and something else. Something that might have been a recognition of a kind Edmund wasn't sure he wanted to be recognized for. By early December, the pattern was roughly 70% complete. Elias worked on one section while Edmund worked on another, their hammers creating a counterpoint rhythm across the platform. And Edmund noticed that Elias's pace was slowing, that his breathing had developed a quality of effort that hadn't been there in September, that the old man's movements, always precise, had taken on a careful economy that spoke of a body beginning to negotiate with its own limitations. When Edmund raised this, Elias dismissed it with the specific impatience of someone who has made a decision about what is and is not relevant and does not wish to revisit it. "I've known this body for 65 years, the old man said. "Long enough to know it will last as long as I need it to. What happens after that is not a concern I can afford." He paused, and then said something that Edmund wrote down word for word. "The work is the concern. The body is just the instrument." Winter deepened. They worked through conditions that should have made the work impossible, clearing snow from the platform each morning before they could begin, their fingers going numb despite the layers they wore. Edmund began keeping his own notebooks in the evenings, recording observations and calculations that Elias had identified but never fully developed. He was no longer simply executing someone else's instructions. He had become invested in the mathematics themselves, in the questions the pattern raised about the nature of space and the relationship between what human beings could perceive and what actually existed. One evening in late January, sitting on opposite sides of the boarding house fire with coffee between them, Elias having come down from the ridge for the first time in weeks, Della having made no comment about this, the old man told Edmund about the other sites. "At minimum 8 more," he said. "Intersection points I've identified mathematically across the broader Appalachian range. Different geological formations, different indigenous protective histories, different convergence cycles. I've tried to model their timelines, but the variables compound, and my confidence in the projections decreases with distance. What I know with certainty is that I can only maintain one. While I'm here, the others are unattended. Some of them have been unattended for decades." He paused into the fire for a long moment. "I used to think about this every day. I've trained myself not to. You can't do the work that's in front of you if you're paralyzed by the work you can't reach." Spring came late that year. The snow held on the ridge into March, and when it finally retreated, the work intensified. The pattern was at 85% completion. Edmund could see now how the finished design would look, how all the individual elements would resolve into a single continuous structure, elegant and terrible in equal measure. And then, on a morning in late April, Elias collapsed. Not dramatically, not with any warning. His hammer simply fell from his hand while he was working on a detail section, and then his body followed it, folding down onto the stone with a quietness that was, in its own way, more alarming than a loud fall would have been. Edmund got him down from the ridge. It took the better part of 2 hours, with Elias conscious but not fully present, his protests weak and more habitual than genuine. Della was there when they came through the door, and she asked no questions, just pointed to the back room that had always been hers and began heating water. Edmund sat beside the bed while Della moved quietly in and out of the room, and he understood, with the particular certainty that arrives without announcement and doesn't require confirmation, that Elias Vane was not going to recover from this. Whatever was failing in him had passed the point where rest and care could turn it back. Elias seemed to understand this too. When he spoke, his voice was weak but entirely lucid. The eyes that found Edmund's face were the clearest they'd ever been. "The notebooks have everything you'll need for the remaining sections, the specifications, the calculations, the sequencing. You understand the mathematics now. You've been doing this long enough that it's become intuitive. The remaining work is perhaps 10 weeks at the pace we've been keeping, maybe 12 if the weather turns." He paused, and then said, "I know what I'm asking. I'm not going to pretend I don't." Edmund looked at him. He thought about what he was before September of last year, a man with a profession and a reasonable life and an orderly understanding of how the world was organized. He thought about the sky that was the wrong color and the shapes moving inside it. He thought about the sounds and the passages beneath the platform. He thought about Elias's word, instrument. He said yes. He didn't say anything else. Something that might have been relief crossed Elias's face. Then the eyes closed. Elias Vane died shortly at midnight. Edmund sat with the body until dawn, not from sentiment, but because moving felt like it required a readiness to engage with the continuing world that he hadn't assembled yet. Della came in and saw what had happened, and she simply nodded and made arrangements. Elias was buried in a small plot at the edge of the settlement, with no marker and no ceremony. The ground closed over him, and the ridge was still there, waiting. Edmund went back up that afternoon. What else was there to do?
The next year and a half became a blur of work and weather and the slow accumulation of understanding. Edmund carved. He calculated. He verified. He cross-referenced his own observations against Elias's notebooks and began adding to them, following implications the old man had noted but left undeveloped, constructing mathematical extensions of the framework that the pattern had shown him were necessary. He was no longer completing a dead man's project. He was doing his own work. The distinction mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully articulate, but it did matter. The people of the Notch let him do it. Provisions at the trailhead, Della's room maintained, the careful, respectful distance of a community that understood, without being told, what kind of weight was being carried on their behalf. The pattern reached completion in early April of 1905, 3 weeks before the convergence date Elias's calculations had projected. Edmund spent those 3 weeks checking and rechecking every measurement, every angle, every spacing ratio. He found no errors. The mathematics held. The pattern was sound. On the evening of April 19th, he activated it for the first time. The glow was stronger than anything he'd seen before, spreading across the full platform in pulses that he realized after a moment were synchronized with his own heartbeat. The shimmer in the air above the stone became visible and sustained, a clear distortion of space itself, not a heat effect, but something that had no appropriate name in any vocabulary Edmund possessed. Through that distortion, he could see the other side more clearly than ever before. The wrong-colored sky, the shapes moving within it. They were closer now, pressing against the boundary with an urgency that was unmistakable, that he could feel through the stone beneath his feet as pressure waves. But the pattern was holding them. He could see it, the geometric structure he and Elias had built, turning the pressure aside, redirecting it, deflecting what tried too hard, and simply refusing the rest. It was working exactly as the mathematics said it should, and that should have been reassuring. What was not reassuring was how hard the things on the other side were working, how systematically they were testing the barrier, probing its geometry with what was, undeniably, intelligence, purpose, memory. They were learning the pattern as the pattern repelled them, cataloging its structure, looking for the weakness that wasn't there. Not yet. All through the night of the 19th, Edmund stood on the platform and watched. At dawn on the 20th, the day of maximum convergence, the light that rose over the eastern ridge was filtered through the distortion in ways that colored the valley below in shades that the trees and stone were not equipped to reflect. The pressure on the barrier increased as the morning progressed. The shapes on the other side became more defined, more present, resolving from abstract movement into something that Edmund could see now clearly. They were not creatures. They were not entities in any biological sense. They were configurations, geometric structures, arrangements of angles and intersecting planes that generated through their movement the impression of intention without anything that could be called form. They were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. They were the most terrible. Watching them press against the boundary was like watching pure mathematics attempt to solve itself into existence, abstraction trying to become concrete, trying to force its way into a world that was built at different ratios. The convergence peaked just after noon. Edmund had to look away from the distortion above the platform, couldn't bear the way space was folding and unfolding, trying to accommodate what was pressing from the other side. The harmonic resonance from the carved pattern was overwhelming, not sound exactly, but a vibration that he felt in his bones and in his teeth and behind his eyes. For nearly an hour he stood there uncertain. Then, slowly, the pressure began to ease. The shapes withdrew. The distortion thinned. The wrong-colored sky visible through it flickered and contracted, and was gone. By mid-afternoon, it was over. Edmund sat down on the platform, his back against the cold stone, and for the first time in months let himself fully experience the weight he'd been carrying. And sitting there in the fading April light, with the valley filling with shadow below him and the sky above returning to its ordinary color, he understood something Elias had tried to tell him and that he'd heard without truly comprehending. There was no going back, not to measuring railroad routes, not to a life organized around ordinary concerns. The knowledge had changed the shape of him in ways that weren't reversible, and the choice now was not whether to carry it, only how, with bitterness as a burden, or with purpose as a kind of calling. He stayed.
Edmund Callaway spent the next 3 decades doing something Elias Vane had never managed to do. He built a network. Not quickly, not easily. The fundamental problem hadn't changed. Explaining the situation to someone who hadn't seen it was exactly as impossible as Elias had warned it would be, and Edmund failed many more times than he succeeded. But he had something the old professor hadn't. He understood the mathematics well enough to lead people to their own observations, rather than asking them to accept his. He could bring the right kind of mind to the right intersection point at the right time, and let the place do the explaining. Over the following years, he identified and visited 6 of the other sites Elias had documented. Some had indigenous protective structures still partially intact. Others had nothing. Raw intersection points with no barrier, no framework, nothing between the convergence and whatever community happened to be living nearest. He did what he could at each one, working alone, adding to his notebooks, writing careful mathematical frameworks that someone else could follow. In 1932, he found his successor at Greystone Notch. Her name was Maren Selby, a geology researcher from a university in the valley who had come to the highlands on a field study and who had a particular quality of mind that Edmund had learned to recognize: the capacity to update her model of reality when her observations demanded it, rather than updating her observations to protect her model. He showed her the platform, he activated the pattern, he let her see. She didn't run, she didn't deny. She sat with it for a long time, the way Edmund had sat with it. And then she said, "How much of the mathematics do I need to learn before I can start maintaining independently?" He spent 6 years teaching her. By the time his own health began its serious decline, she understood the work well enough to extend it, had already begun identifying mathematical refinements that Elias had never considered, extending the framework in directions that addressed vulnerabilities Edmund hadn't fully solved. Edmund Callaway died in the boarding house at Greystone Notch in the spring of 1938, 41 years after he'd first arrived to measure railroad routes through the highlands. Maren buried him beside Elias Vane, 2 graves with no markers at the edge of a settlement that no longer exists on any map. Maren maintained the barriers for 31 years, found her own successor in 1963, and documented everything in notebooks that have been cross-referenced and extended by each subsequent guardian. The lineage continues, the mathematics have evolved, the convergences come and are met, and the barrier holds, and the world goes about its business in complete ignorance of what happens at Bracken's crown every time the astronomical cycles complete their turn. This is where the verifiable record ends. What I can tell you is that Edmund Callaway's original field notebooks exist. They are held by a private archive in Virginia, not a public institution, which is why you haven't heard of them. I've seen scans of select pages. The handwriting change I described, before and after his encounter with Elias Vane on the ridge in 1897, is exactly as I described it. You can see it happen mid-entry. Whatever occurred on that ridgeline on that autumn morning in 1897, it changed the way Edmund Callaway wrote. What I can also tell you is that there are locations in the Appalachian Range where carved stone markings exist that match no known indigenous language or notation system, that feature geometric properties researchers have struggled to account for under conventional physics, and where people who have spent extended time report experiences that bear a striking resemblance to what Edmund documented in those notebooks. I am not telling you what to conclude from this. I will say that Elias Vane's core observation that the indigenous people of these mountains organized their culture around the management of something they understood intuitively, and that the displacement of those people created a gap that someone had to fill, is not a supernatural claim. It's a pattern that appears, in various forms, across every landscape where ancient indigenous knowledge has been interrupted. The question of what that knowledge was managing is a separate matter. What I find myself thinking about is Edmund, the man who left. He had a life, a career, a reasonable understanding of how the world worked. He encountered something that didn't fit, and instead of making the evidence fit his existing framework, he let his framework change, and then he stayed. Not because he was trapped, not because he had no other options, because the alternative, knowing what he knew and walking away from it, would have been a kind of death, and he preferred this particular life, however strange and hard and costly, to that particular safety. I think about the places we don't go in our own minds for the same reason, the questions we don't follow to their conclusions, the experiences we file away under trick of the light, or I was tired, or that doesn't make sense, so it didn't happen. I think about what it cost to take those experiences seriously, and what it might cost not to. The next time you're in the mountains, or anywhere that feels like it has a different quality of silence, a thickness to the air that you can't quite account for, pay attention. Not because you'll see anything Edmund Callaway saw, probably you won't, but because he was paying attention, and that's the only reason he understood what was happening in time to do anything about it. Make of that what you will. Before you go, I need you to do something. If any part of this story lodged in you, any moment that felt more like recognition than narrative, I want to know what it was. Drop the timestamp in the comments. I read them. And I find consistently that the moments people stop at are not always the moments I expected. Second thing, there are details in this story that I deliberately layered. Things that mean one thing the first time you hear them and something entirely different once you know how it ends. A few people who've heard early versions of this story have come back and said they couldn't believe how much they missed the first time. I'm curious whether that's true for you. If you're new here, this is what we do. Documented mysteries, historical horror, the places where the archival record runs up against something it doesn't have the vocabulary for. Subscribe. The next story is already in progress, and it goes somewhere I genuinely did not expect when I started researching it. Until then, take care of yourselves, and pay attention to the places that feel thicker than they should. There might be reasons.